Let's look at deploying this extension now. We're going to ask my machine to stand in for being the second machine that we're going to deploy it to. So at the moment, as you know, if we look under the extension manager here in our sort of regular install, there are no extensions in here. It's only when I run my application and launch the experimental instance that my extension is installed into the experimental instance. So you can see it there, and there's several problems with it. For one thing, it has this crummy description, and the author and so forth are really not useful information, but also it's difficult to imagine a more complex deploy technique than, well, you know, open this solution in Visual Studio and build it, and then hit F5 and that'll launch a different version of Visual Studio, and that version of Visual Studio will have the extension installed. Clearly that's not how we're going to be deploying our extension. In fact, it's a very simple matter of a double click to install an extension that's deployed with a v6. And that's what this project's going to create. We said we wanted a new empty v6 project. We've added things to it, and we're arranging for our payload, the working assemblies and so on, to end up in a v6 file, and that's the unit of deployment for extensions. And a really important component of the v6 file is what's called the v6 manifest. We have one here in this project. It's just XML. And you can see that the author and the description and so forth are in this XML. And we could work on this and edit this way, but it's a lot easier if you just double click it. And then you get this designer view with the same information but highlighted in an easier to work with way. Now, the wizard that created the project set these initial things up, and you can guess that some things, like the product name, came from the name we gave our project, and other things are sort of hard-coded into the template. So what we'd like to do is overwrite these with better values. And let's start with the ID. It's important that the ID be unique. So lots and lots of people might use the same extension idea, and they might use the same starting template to create the thing with that idea. So if 100 people all go out there and make a to-do marker extension, then they're all going to have potentially ID collisions. And the best way to prevent the ID collisions is to use sort of hierarchical naming scheme, where you would say my company dot to-do marker. I could put Kate Gregory, you could put your name, what have you. Then we can all have our own to-do markers, and there isn't going to be any collisions. I'm going to put my name in the author. And a better description, of course. Draws an orange circle in the margin next to lines with to-do. We can set the icon and the preview and provide URLs for people to come to learn more about your product or to download the help. And if you're actually making sort of a nice packaged extension that you want lots of people to use, I strongly encourage you to fill those fields in and use those. But I'm going to leave these, I've settled for changing the name and the author and the ID to reflect me, and to put in a better description. So having saved that, I can now rebuild. And now let's run once again. So here in the experimental instance, I'm going to start by bringing up the extension manager. And what you see is there are actually two extensions now installed into the experimental instance. The original one that got installed the first time we pressed F5, and now this better one with our description and author and so forth and so on that was installed when we pressed F5 this most recent time. So I'm just going to uninstall the old one. And it prompts you down here, you must restart Visual Studio, so I'll allow it to do that. And now I can open up an application. And you can see that the extension is working fine. If I go out in the Tools menu again and bring up Extension Manager, there's just the one installed. So I've fixed up my manifest to have my values in there, and I've cleaned up the experimental instance so that now only the newly renamed and proper value is installed there. So that's great.